Kids like you don't walk in here with that kind of money. You must have stolen it." The bank employee's words cut through the air like a knife, and in that moment, a 14-year-old boy who only wanted to open his very first checking account was treated like a criminal before he even had a chance to speak. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from, subscribe, and hit like if you believe no child should endure this. It began on a warm Tuesday afternoon in Houston when young Ethan Carter stepped off the bus and walked toward the glass doors of Heritage National Bank, his heart beating fast. In the worn backpack on his shoulders was a neat envelope filled with $1,200 he had saved from tutoring kids in math, birthday gifts from his grandmother, and rewards from his father each time he earned perfect grades. Ethan was proud. This was not just money. It was proof that he was growing up, proof that he could be responsible, proof that he was ready to take the first step toward independence. His father, David Carter, had always taught him that discipline and honesty mattered more than anything. But David was also a powerful man, the CEO of Carter Financial Holdings, a company that quietly owned more than half of Heritage National Bank. Most people in Houston's business world knew the name David Carter, but almost no one knew Ethan was his son. David had worked hard to keep his boy's life private, to let him grow up away from headlines. So when Ethan pushed open the doors of that bank, he walked in like any other kid, not as the heir to a financial empire. And he expected nothing more than to be treated fairly. Ethan had rehearsed this moment in his room, practicing how he would say, "Good afternoon. I'd like to open my first checking account." He had organized every piece of documentation his school required for him to leave early. His student ID, his birth certificate, his grade reports, all carefully placed in a clear folder. He wanted to look serious, prepared, mature. But the moment he reached the counter and met the eyes of teller Melissa Green, everything started to crumble. Melissa looked him up and down, saw the school uniform, the brown skin, the nervous smile, and her expression shifted from routine politeness to thinly veiled contempt. When Ethan laid the envelope of cash gently on the counter, her lips curled. "What is this? Are you kidding me?" she said, loud enough for people in line to hear. Ethan swallowed, kept his voice steady. "I'd like to open my first account. This is my savings." But Melissa laughed, not kindly, but with mockery. "A 14-year-old with $1,200 in cash. Do you expect me to believe that? I know where kids like you get money, and it's not from birthday gifts." The words stunned Ethan. Kids like you. The phrase hit harder than a slap. He tried to explain. Said he tutored classmates. Said his grandmother gave him money every year. Said his father rewarded him for grades. But Melissa had already decided he was lying. She waved her hand, dismissing his explanations like they were excuses from a child who had been caught. "This isn't a game. We're not some corner store. This is a national bank, and I'm not opening anything for you." Ethan felt the room closing in, a line of customers shifting impatiently behind him, some glancing at him with pity, others with suspicion. He took a deep breath, fought back the sting in his eyes, and tried again. "Please, I just want to call my dad. He can vouch for me. He has an account here, too." But Melissa shook her head, reached for the phone, and smirked. "No need to call anyone. I'm getting my manager. She knows exactly how to deal with situations like this." Ethan's stomach dropped. Situations like this. The phrase echoed in his mind, as if he were already guilty of something he had not done. Within minutes, a tall woman in a dark blazer walked briskly from the back office. This was Karen Brooks, the branch manager. Her reputation among staff was strict and controlling. She had been in banking more than 20 years and carried herself as though she owned the place. Melissa leaned in, whispered quickly, gestured toward Ethan and the envelope. Karen nodded, eyes narrowing. Then she turned her full attention on the boy. "Where did you get this money?" she demanded, her tone sharp, no greeting. No courtesy. Only suspicion. Ethan fumbled for words, repeated what he had already explained, showed his documents, even produced a card his grandmother had signed with birthday wishes. But Karen brushed it all aside, didn't even glance at the handwriting. "I've seen this trick before," she said coldly. "A kid comes in with a story, a pile of cash, pretending it's legitimate, but really it's stolen, or worse. It's drug money handed off by adults. You think we're stupid?" Ethan's throat tightened, the humiliation unbearable. Customers nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Some leaned slightly closer. No one spoke in his defense. He looked around desperately, hoping for a kind face. But all he saw was indifference. Karen leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper only he and Melissa could hear. "Tell me the truth. Your parents sent you to launder this money, didn't they?" Ethan's eyes widened. He shook his head violently. "No, ma'am. This is mine. I earned it." "Please just believe me." But Karen pulled back with a cold smile. "I don't believe you. And I'm not letting you walk out of here with that cash. I'm calling the police." She turned and picked up the phone, dialing without hesitation. As she spoke, her voice grew louder. "Yes, officers. I have a young suspect here, appears to be involved in theft and possibly fraud. Yes, aggressive, refusing to cooperate. Please come quickly." Ethan stood frozen, his heart hammering. He felt the weight of every eye in the bank pressing down on him. He wanted to cry, wanted to scream that he was innocent. But his voice caught in his throat. He managed only a whisper to himself. "Dad, please answer." As he pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers shaking so badly he could barely type. And with one desperate burst of courage, he sent a single message. "Dad, they called the cops on me. Please help. I'm scared." And hit send, just as Karen slammed the receiver down and barked at him to put the phone away. The message was gone, racing across the city toward a man in a downtown boardroom. A man who would change the entire course of what was about to unfold, because what Karen Brooks did not know, what Melissa Green did not know, what no one in that bank could have imagined, was that the boy they had just accused of theft was the son of the man who owned the very institution they worked for. And within the hour, their world would come crashing down around them. The police arrived faster than Ethan could have imagined. The heavy glass doors of the bank swung open and two uniformed officers stepped in. Officer James Miller with a stiff posture and a hard face, and Officer Linda Perez, calm but firm. They didn't pause to ask questions, didn't glance at the paperwork Ethan had laid out. Instead, they walked straight to the counter where Karen Brooks stood waiting like a hunter who had trapped her prey. "That's him," Karen declared, pointing at the trembling 14-year-old. "He came in with suspicious cash, refused to explain, became aggressive. I believe he is laundering money for adults." The words were sharp and confident, spoken with the authority of someone who expected to be believed. Ethan's knees felt weak. His voice shook as he said, "Please, officers, that's not true. This is my money. I earned it tutoring. It's my savings. I just wanted to open an account." But Officer Miller didn't bother to hide his skepticism. "We've heard it all before, kid. You'll have a chance to explain at the station," he said as he reached for the cuffs. Ethan flinched back, tears forming in his eyes, the humiliation overwhelming. The customers who had been pretending not to watch were now openly staring, some even pulling out their phones to record. One man whispered, "He's just a child. Maybe you should check his ID." But no one dared speak louder. No one dared confront the manager or the police. The fear of authority kept them silent. Officer Perez stepped closer. "Turn around, son. Hands behind your back." Her tone sounded professional but detached, as if this were just another routine call. Ethan's voice cracked. "Please, I have everything here. My birth certificate, my school ID. Look at it. Just look at it. I'm not lying. But Karen crossed her arms, her lips twisting in satisfaction. Don't waste your time with his little tricks. I told you he's trouble. The words little tricks cut into Ethan's chest. His documents, carefully gathered with so much pride, reduced to nothing by prejudice. He felt the cold steel of the cuffs snap shut around his wrists, the click echoing through the lobby like a gunshot. People gasped. An elderly woman near the teller line shook her head and muttered softly, "This isn't right." But again, no one stepped forward. The silence of the crowd made the injustice heavier. Ethan's cheeks were wet now, his voice breaking as he pleaded. I just wanted to prove to my dad I could handle money on my own. I didn't steal anything. The officers began walking him toward the door. Karen's heels clicked behind them, her satisfaction barely contained. Melissa smirked from the counter, whispering something to a coworker who chuckled under his breath. Ethan felt smaller with every step, every pair of eyes burning into him. He thought of his father, thought of the pride he wanted to see in his dad's face, and the thought twisted into shame. What would his dad think if he saw him like this? Handcuffed, treated like a criminal. The boy swallowed hard and whispered to himself, "Please, Dad. Hurry." In his pocket. His phone buzzed once. He knew the message had gone through. He clung to that fragile hope. Meanwhile, across town in a gleaming tower of glass, David Carter sat at the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by executives discussing market forecasts. The numbers were large, the voices professional, but David's attention shattered when his phone lit up. The special emergency contact he had set for his son flashing on the screen. He picked it up, read the message, and in an instant, the calm, composed leader known for his measured decisions transformed. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened. He rose so suddenly his chair crashed against the wall. "This meeting is over," he said, his voice low but filled with fury. The executives exchanged startled looks. No one dared to ask why. They had never seen David like this. He was a man who built empires with logic and patience, but now he looked like a storm about to break. As he strode toward the door, he was already dialing. "Robert, meet me at Heritage Bank downtown. Now. It's Ethan." His private attorney's voice crackled through the line, promising to arrive within minutes. Next, he called his head of security, a former police captain named Samuel Grant, who immediately mobilized 2 men to meet him at the bank. Within moments, David was in the back seat of his Bentley, his driver weaving through Houston traffic with sirens in the distance. Every second felt like an eternity. David's mind raced. He pictured his son's face, remembered the pride Ethan had shown when he said he wanted to open his first account, remembered the envelope of money Ethan had carried with such care. And fury built in his chest. If anyone had dared to humiliate his child, they would soon understand the weight of their mistake. Back at the bank, the situation escalated. Officer Miller had taken Ethan outside, pressing him toward the squad car. Cameras from bystanders followed every move. One teenager across the street live-streamed it on social media, his voice narrating. "They're arresting a kid. He looks scared. I think he's only a freshman." The video began gaining traction online within minutes, people commenting in outrage as they watched a boy in school uniform being handcuffed like a hardened criminal. Inside the branch, Karen spoke with Officer Perez, feeding her version of the story. "You saw him. Evasive, suspicious, carrying cash like that. No explanation that made sense. I had no choice but to call you." Perez nodded, jotting notes, unaware that her body camera was capturing not only Karen's accusations, but also the disdain dripping from her voice. Disdain that would later become undeniable evidence. Ethan stood beside the squad car, head hanging, wrists aching from the cuffs, his tears falling onto the pavement. "I didn't do anything wrong," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but the live stream caught it. Millions of viewers would later replay those words. In that moment, though, he felt utterly alone, powerless, waiting for the world to crash down. But across town, the storm was already on its way. David Carter's car sped through traffic, his security detail on the radio clearing the entrance. And within minutes, the man who held the fate of the very institution that humiliated his son would step inside. And the people who thought they were untouchable would learn that they had just set fire to their own careers. The air in the bank grew heavy as the sound of sirens outside grew louder. Customers whispered, some beginning to sense that what they had just witnessed was not routine, but a tragedy unfolding. None of them knew yet that the next chapter would expose truths they never imagined, and that the name Carter carried more weight in those walls than anyone had realized. The black Bentley screeched to a stop in front of Heritage National Bank. The door swung open, and David Carter stepped out, his tall frame radiating a quiet fury that made even strangers on the sidewalk instinctively move aside. Behind him came Robert King, the attorney, in a dark suit with a leather briefcase in hand, and Samuel Grant, the head of security, flanked by two men who looked like they could hold their ground against anyone. The crowd of onlookers who had gathered outside parted as David strode forward, his eyes fixed on the glass doors where just minutes before his only son had been dragged out in handcuffs. The officers near the squad car froze. Officer Miller stiffened and muttered, "Sir, this is police business." But David didn't break stride, his voice calm but lethal. "Take those handcuffs off my son. Now." The authority in his tone left no room for debate. Miller hesitated, glancing at Karen Brooks, who had just emerged from the branch with her arms folded, a smirk still lingering as if she were savoring her triumph. She saw David and scoffed. "And who exactly do you think you are? This boy was caught with suspicious money. We were following procedure." But David ignored her and crouched in front of Ethan, his hands gentle as he looked into his son's tear-streaked face. "It's okay, son. I'm here," he said softly. Ethan's eyes widened in relief, his small voice breaking. "Dad, I didn't do anything. I just wanted to open an account." David nodded firmly. "I know, and everyone here is about to know too." Then he stood, his presence towering over the officers, his hand outstretched. "Keys, now." Miller fumbled, the weight of the growing crowd and the presence of cameras pressing on him. Reluctantly, he unlocked the cuffs. Ethan rubbed his wrists, the red marks vivid against his skin. The live stream captured every second. Robert King turned to the bystanders and declared loudly, "This is an unlawful detainment of a minor. We will be filing civil rights charges immediately," the crowd murmured. Phones lifted higher, sensing history in the making. Karen tried to regain control, her voice rising. "This is ridiculous. That boy had over $1,000 in cash. No legitimate explanation. Of course we called the police." David turned his gaze on her, his eyes cold as steel. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a card, heavy stock with gold lettering. He placed it deliberately into her hand. "David Carter, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, Carter Financial Holdings," he said slowly so every syllable carried. Karen glanced at the card and paled. Robert King stepped closer, his voice sharp. "For the record, Carter Financial Holdings owns 51% of Heritage National Bank. That makes my client not just a customer but the controlling owner of this institution. And you just accused his son of money laundering without even verifying identification. Do you understand the magnitude of the mistake you have made?" The silence was heavy. Ethan stood close to his father, trembling but steadier now. David gestured toward the glass doors. "Inside. All of you. We're reviewing the footage." Samuel Grant's men pushed the doors open, and the entire group moved back into the branch. The employees inside looked up in shock as their manager marched in, trailed by a man they recognized from financial magazines. The same man whose decisions shaped the very bank they worked for. Thomas Reynolds, the chairman of the board, had been called by Robert King moments earlier and now rushed in through the side entrance, his face pale. He went straight to David. "I came as soon as I heard. My God, David. What happened?" David's jaw tightened. He pointed at Karen. "What happened is that your branch manager racially profiled my son, dismissed his documents, called him a criminal, and had him cuffed like an animal." Gasps rippled through the staff. Thomas turned to Karen. "Is this true?" Karen stammered. "Sir, I followed protocol. The boy had too much cash. I had reason to suspect." But David cut her off with a raised hand. "Stop. We're done with excuses. Roll the security footage." Samuel signaled the guard. Within minutes, a monitor was wheeled out. The grainy black and white images flickered. Everyone watched as Ethan walked in politely, smiled, placed his documents and money on the counter. They saw Melissa's face twist in disdain, saw Karen enter and immediately treat him with suspicion, saw Ethan present identification again and again, saw Karen wave it away, then lean in with words that, though without audio, were clear in expression, disdain and hostility written across her face. The crowd in the lobby murmured louder. Customers who had witnessed it nodded, confirming what the video showed. David's voice rang out, steady and cutting. "This is your proof. A boy with documents, polite, patient, humiliated simply because of the color of his skin. My son." Thomas Reynolds pressed his hand to his forehead. He looked sick. He turned sharply to Karen. "You are finished here. Effective immediately." The words dropped like a hammer. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came. Her face drained of color. Robert King added, "And not only finished, Ms. Brooks, but you will face federal charges for filing a false police report. Your voice is on the 911 call exaggerating and fabricating claims about aggression that never occurred. That is a crime, and you will answer for it." Melissa Green tried to slip quietly back behind the counter, but David pointed at her too. "And you, the one who first sneered at my son, who laughed at him, who dismissed his documents, you are done as well." Tears welled in Melissa's eyes, but no sympathy came. Security guards moved in, escorting both women out while phones recorded every step. The humiliation now theirs to carry. Ethan stood by his father's side, watching as justice unfolded before him. The boy who had walked in with pride and walked out in handcuffs was now seeing the truth of power wielded not to dominate, but to defend. Karen protested weakly as she was led away. "You can't do this. I've worked here 20 years. But David's voice stopped her cold. "And in one afternoon you threw it all away because you saw a black boy with money and decided he was a thief. 20 years gone in 20 minutes. That's the cost of prejudice." The crowd erupted in applause. The customers who had stayed silent earlier now clapped and shouted. "That's right," one man yelled. "About time someone said it." The officers stood awkwardly, unsure, until Thomas Reynolds turned on them. "Both of you will face an internal review for detaining a minor without checking documentation. Hand in your badges to your chief. This is unacceptable." Miller flushed red. Perez looked down in shame. The live stream caught it all. Tens of thousands now watching. Ethan leaned against his father, whispering, "Thank you, Dad." David placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, his voice low but resolute. "No, son. Thank you for showing more courage today than most adults ever will. And this is only the beginning. We will make sure this never happens to you. Or any kid. Again." In that moment, the tide had turned. The boy who had entered the bank alone was now shielded by a father whose power and love converged. And the staff who thought they held authority were about to learn that their authority ended where justice began. What had started as a routine errand had become the spark of a reckoning, one that would spread far beyond the walls of that branch. The lobby of Heritage National Bank was silent, except for the sound of phones buzzing as news of the confrontation spread in real time. David Carter stood tall in the center, his hand still resting on Ethan's shoulder, his eyes fixed on the faces of employees who had witnessed the humiliation of his son and chosen silence. His voice broke that silence like a gavel in a courtroom. This is not just about my boy. This is about every customer who has walked into this branch and been judged by the color of their skin, by their age, by their clothing, instead of by the truth in their hands. The words carried across the marble floor and struck deep. Thomas Reynolds, the board chairman, swallowed hard, knowing every customer recording this moment would soon be broadcasting it across the city. David pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed directly. No hesitation. Get me the full board on a secure call in 5 minutes. I don't care if they're in meetings. Get them now. His assistant answered on the other end and immediately scrambled to comply. Robert King, the attorney, leaned closer and whispered, David, we already have enough here to bring civil charges and push for federal oversight. But David shook his head. This goes deeper than lawsuits. This is about reform. Then louder. Samuel, bring the district manager here. I want every leader in this region standing in this lobby today. The guards moved quickly, staff scattering to obey. Karen Brooks had been marched out, but her shadow still lingered. Her 20 years of prejudice now exposed in one afternoon. Melissa Green had been escorted to the back to clear her desk, and the officers who had cuffed Ethan stood awkwardly near the door, their radios crackling, unsure whether to stay or retreat. David pointed directly at them. Your actions will be reviewed by internal affairs. Your body cameras will show the truth. And if they reveal the pattern I suspect, you will never put cuffs on another child again. Officer Miller clenched his jaw. Perez nodded silently, the weight of consequence finally sinking in. Ethan looked up at his father with wide eyes, not just relief, but awe. He had never seen his father this way, not as the gentle parent at home, not as the executive hidden in boardrooms, but as a force of nature defending what mattered most. David's phone buzzed and he answered on speaker. The voices of 12 board members filled the air. David, what is going on? We are hearing rumors of a public scene, one voice demanded. David's reply was calm but searing. What is going on is that your bank, the institution that bears our name and thrives on our capital, just profiled and humiliated my 14-year-old son, handcuffed him, and dragged him out like a criminal for daring to bring in his own money. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the line. Another director asked carefully, Are you certain? Could this be a misunderstanding? David raised his voice. There is no misunderstanding. There is video. There are witnesses. There is a live stream with tens of thousands already watching. This board will convene tonight, and tomorrow morning you will announce sweeping reforms, or I will call a shareholders' vote to replace every one of you who resists. The room fell silent. Thomas Reynolds stepped forward. David, we will support you. The board will act. This is bigger than one branch. David ended the call and looked around the lobby once more, his voice carrying with the weight of finality. Let me be very clear. Racism is not a training issue. It is not a mistake to be patched over with apologies. It is a cancer that destroys institutions from the inside, and as of today, it ends here, not just for my son, but for every child who walks through these doors. Applause broke out among customers who only moments ago had been frozen in fear. One woman shouted, "Amen to that!" Another man raised his phone and said, "This is history right here." Robert King stepped to David's side, his tone official. Effective immediately, we will be drafting new compliance measures, including a requirement that no minor can be reported to law enforcement without dual managerial approval and documented evidence. Any violation will result in termination. Thomas Reynolds nodded gravely. We will implement it system-wide, David added. And more. Every employee from the teller to the executive suite will complete 60 hours of mandatory training on implicit bias. Not online slideshows, but live sessions with real accountability. And if anyone resists, they can clear their desks today. Murmurs spread among the staff, fear and relief mixing. Samuel returned with the district manager, a nervous man in his 50s. David turned to him. "You will oversee the audit of this branch. Every interaction in the past year reviewed, every complaint re-examined, and you will report directly to me, not through the usual chain." The man nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Absolutely." Ethan clung closer to his father, feeling safe now but still shaken. David noticed and bent down, his voice low and steady. "Son, you did nothing wrong. Do you understand? Nothing. This is on them, not you." Ethan nodded through tears, the words finally beginning to soothe the ache in his chest. Outside the bank, the live stream continued, now joined by local news crews who had rushed to the scene. Reporters pressed against the glass, capturing every word. David turned to face them through the doors, his voice rising. "To the community watching, to the parents, to the children, know this. What happened today will not be swept under the rug. Not in this city, not in this country. My son's pain will become the turning point, and Heritage National Bank will either change or it will burn and be rebuilt from the ground up." The crowd outside erupted, chants of "Justice for Ethan" rising, echoing off the buildings. The once quiet lobby had become the epicenter of a storm. But David remained calm, his arm around his son, his gaze unflinching. He had been underestimated before. He had been challenged in boardrooms and in markets, but never had an insult cut this deep. Never had an attack been so personal, and never had his resolve been stronger. What began as humiliation for a boy had transformed into a reckoning for an entire system. The reckoning was only just beginning. By the time David Carter left the lobby of Heritage National Bank with his arm around Ethan, the story was no longer just a local confrontation. It was a wildfire consuming the city. The live stream that captured Ethan being handcuffed had already been shared hundreds of thousands of times. Hashtags like "Justice for Ethan" and "Stop Bank Racism" climbed to the top of social media. And within hours, cable news anchors were running the footage on a loop. The image of a 14-year-old boy in a school uniform being treated like a hardened criminal ignited outrage across the nation. Commentators asked how a bank that prided itself on serving the community could let this happen. And the answer was as clear as the video itself. Prejudice had replaced professionalism, and arrogance had blinded employees to truth. Karen Brooks, who just that morning walked into her branch as a respected manager, now found her name plastered across headlines. Disgraced. Accused not just of poor judgment, but of outright racial profiling and filing a false report. Melissa Green, who laughed at Ethan's request, was no longer simply a teller. She was a symbol of contempt caught on camera. Both women were escorted from the premises. Their careers finished in one public sweep, yet the consequences stretched further. Officer James Miller and Officer Linda Perez were suspended pending investigation, their body camera footage pulled by Internal Affairs, and the data revealed what David suspected: patterns of bias in stops, patterns in arrests, and language on reports that painted young black suspects as threats before any evidence was gathered. Within days, the police chief held a press conference announcing a full review of youth arrest procedures, promising that children would no longer be cuffed without documented probable cause. But the community was not satisfied with promises. They demanded action. Outside the same bank branch, protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Our children deserve better and dignity, not handcuffs." Mothers pushed strollers, fathers lifted toddlers onto their shoulders, teenagers marched chanting Ethan's name. The bank itself became a symbol of systemic failure. Thomas Reynolds, the board chairman, convened an emergency meeting with executives under David's watchful eye. The message was blunt: either change or collapse. Heritage National's stock price dipped as investors feared lawsuits and boycotts. But David acted swiftly, announcing on live television a reform package that stunned the industry. First, a new youth banking division staffed by specialists trained to serve minors with patience and respect. Second, a 60-hour mandatory anti-bias curriculum for every employee. Third, an independent oversight council with members from the community to review complaints of discrimination. And fourth, the Carter Youth Justice Fund, $75 million dedicated to legal aid and financial education for families who had faced barriers. The press conference was carried on every major network. David stood at the podium with Ethan beside him, his son nervous but determined. When the reporter asked Ethan what message he wanted to share, the boy looked into the cameras and said, his voice cracking but strong, "I'm not the only kid this happened to. I just want every child to be treated fair, no matter who they are." The crowd erupted in applause. People wiped tears as they listened. The simple honesty of a 14-year-old cut deeper than any prepared statement. That clip was replayed millions of times. Ethan's words echoed in schools, churches, and homes, while David's reforms triggered conversations in boardrooms across the country. Other banks suddenly rushed to announce their own youth initiatives, desperate not to be left behind. But for Karen Brooks, the downfall was swift and merciless. Terminated for cause. Banned from re-entering any bank property. Her reputation destroyed. Job offers evaporated the moment her name appeared on applications. She sat at home watching the same footage the nation watched, realizing that in 20 minutes she had lost not just a career but her identity. Melissa Green fared no better. Her smirk at Ethan's expense replayed endlessly, turning her into a cautionary meme. Her friends stopped calling. Her family begged her to stay off the internet. Yet the stain remained, and the officers faced hearings where data showed disproportionate arrests of black youth. Their records now evidence of systemic rot. Miller defensive, Perez tearful, but neither able to deny the numbers. The community demanded their removal, and lawsuits loomed. For Ethan, the days following were overwhelming, his face on television, his name trending online, classmates sending messages of support, strangers calling him brave. Yet at night he still woke shaking, replaying the moment the cuffs snapped shut. He confessed to his father, "I still feel like I did something wrong." And David pulled him close, whispering, "You did everything right. They were wrong. Remember that." Those words steadied him, slowly turning fear into resolve. 3 weeks later, Ethan stood on a stage at a community center, invited to speak at a youth forum. His speech was short but powerful. "Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong. You have the right to be here, to learn, to save, to dream." The audience rose to their feet, cheering. The boy who once trembled now inspired others. Meanwhile, David's reforms moved faster than anyone expected. Within 2 months, every branch displayed posters outlining youth customer rights. Hotlines were staffed around the clock, and quarterly audits were announced publicly. Transparency replacing secrecy. Investors regained confidence. The stock rebounded, and analysts predicted Heritage National would become a model for equitable finance. But David cared little for applause. His focus was his son. Every night they sat together, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about simple things like homework and basketball, but always with the unspoken bond forged in that ordeal. Ethan had seen his father fight for him, and David had seen his son endure humiliation with dignity. The scandal that began with handcuffs ended with hope, yet the scars would remain, a reminder of how quickly innocence can be stolen and how fiercely it must be defended. And though Karen Brooks sat in her quiet house with blinds drawn, her career in ashes, the world had moved on without her, leaving her name as a warning in training manuals and seminars, a living example of how prejudice destroys not only its victims, but those who practice it. While Ethan Carter walked forward into his future, no longer just a boy opening a bank account, but a young man whose story had already changed the system around him. And this was only the beginning. The weeks turned into months, and the storm that began with one humiliating afternoon at a bank branch had grown into something far larger. David Carter's sweeping reforms rippled through Heritage National Bank and beyond, forcing an industry that had long hidden behind polished advertisements to confront uncomfortable truths. Every employee, from the teller at the front desk to executives in corner offices, now sat in mandatory training sessions. Role-playing scenarios where children of every background walked in to open accounts, learning how to listen, how to respect, how to put dignity before suspicion. Cameras monitored interactions, not to catch minor mistakes, but to ensure that never again would a boy like Ethan be treated as a criminal for daring to save his own money. Monthly reports were published for the first time in the bank's history, listing complaints, resolutions, and disciplinary actions. Customers were shocked to see transparency in an industry known for secrecy, and the Carter Youth Justice Fund had already disbursed millions in grants to families who faced discrimination, paying legal fees, offering financial literacy programs, and establishing youth banking fairs in schools across Texas. Yet the firestorm was not limited to banking. The Houston Police Department found itself under intense national scrutiny. Internal affairs poured over the body camera footage of Officers Miller and Perez. The recordings showed not only their quick decision to cuff Ethan, but dozens of encounters where young black boys were treated as suspects first and children second. The numbers were damning. Miller had arrested minors of color at a rate 3 times higher than his peers. Perez's record showed a pattern of using force disproportionately. The chief of police had no choice but to act. Both officers were placed on indefinite leave. Hearings were scheduled, and prosecutors began reviewing old cases where their testimony was central. Families once ignored now lined up to demand justice. Community leaders who had begged for reform finally had the evidence they needed. Town halls erupted with emotion. Parents stood up holding photos of their children, some in tears, declaring that what happened to Ethan was what happened to countless others. Only this time, the boy had a powerful father who refused to let it be swept away. National reporters descended on Houston. Documentaries were pitched, and editorials filled the newspapers. One headline read, "The Boy Who Changed Banking." Another, "A Father's Fury Sparks Reform." But behind the headlines lived a quieter story. The healing of a 14-year-old who had carried the weight of humiliation heavier than any backpack. Ethan returned to school where classmates whispered about seeing him on television. Some treated him like a hero, others with awkward silence. He struggled at first, replaying the sound of the cuffs in his mind, waking at night with a start. His father noticed and arranged for a counselor to meet with him, helping him talk through the pain. But slowly, with each passing week, Ethan's shame turned into resolve. He began to read about civil rights leaders, about young people who had stood against injustice. He saw himself not only as a victim, but as someone with a voice. And when the Carter Youth Justice Fund held its first community event, Ethan insisted on speaking. David was hesitant, not wanting his son exposed again. But Ethan's eyes held a steady fire. "Dad, they need to hear from me, not just from you," he said. And so, on a spring afternoon, 3 months after the incident, Ethan stood on a stage in a crowded community center. Microphones pointed at him, hundreds of parents, children, and local officials in the audience. His voice trembled at first but grew stronger. "I was treated like I didn't belong, like I was lying, like I was dangerous. But I know I wasn't. I was just a kid trying to open an account. And I know I'm not the only one. So if you've ever felt that way, if your child has ever been looked at like they didn't belong, I'm here to tell you, we do belong. We matter." The room erupted in applause. Tears streamed down cheeks. And David, standing off to the side, felt a swell of pride deeper than any boardroom victory could bring. From that day forward, Ethan became more than the boy at the center of a scandal. He became a symbol of youth resilience, invited to speak at schools, churches, and civic organizations. His words simple but undeniable. While behind the scenes, the system continued to shift. The Board of Heritage National passed new bylaws making discrimination a fireable offense with no appeal. Quarterly audits were broadcast publicly, and other banks copied the model, not out of goodwill, but out of fear of being the next headline. In Houston, the police department introduced a civilian oversight board. Parents and educators sitting side by side with officers to review complaints. New rules required officers to verify identification and seek a supervisor's approval before cuffing any minor. Training on implicit bias was no longer optional. It was mandatory every 6 months. Skeptics doubted it would change hearts, but at least it would change behaviors. And for the first time in years, community trust ticked upward. But while institutions scrambled, the personal consequences for those who had sparked the fire were harsh. Karen Brooks, once a respected manager, now faced criminal charges for filing a false police report. Her mugshot appeared on evening news, her attorney claiming stress and misunderstanding. But the audio from her 911 call betrayed her, exaggerating Ethan's behavior, describing aggression that never existed. Prosecutors pressed forward. Melissa Green slipped into obscurity, working short-term jobs far from banking. Yet her smirk in that viral video haunted her wherever she went. Strangers recognized her, whispered, avoided, her career destroyed by 30 careless seconds of contempt. Officer Miller resigned before the hearings could conclude, knowing the data would bury him. While Officer Perez fought to stay but was demoted and reassigned, her reputation scarred. Meanwhile, David continued to push, expanding the Carter Youth Justice Fund into a national platform, pledging to triple its resources. And Ethan, though still just a teenager, sat in planning meetings. His voice counted, his ideas heard. One evening, father and son drove home together after a long day of meetings and media. Ethan gazed out the window and said softly, "Dad, I didn't want this to happen, but maybe it had to, so other kids don't go through it." David gripped the wheel, eyes misting. "Son, you're right. Sometimes the world tries to break us, but if we hold together, we can bend it back toward justice." In that moment, the weight between them lifted, replaced by a bond unshakable. And though the scars of that day at the bank would never fully fade, they had become something greater, a reminder of what was lost and a promise of what must never be lost again. 9 months after that afternoon, when a 14-year-old boy was humiliated at a bank counter, Ethan Carter walked back through the glass doors of Heritage National Bank. But this time the air was different. The silence was not heavy with suspicion, but respectful. The staff straightened when they saw him. Customers whispered in recognition, and the once trembling child now carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had endured the fire and come out stronger. The first time he had walked into this building, he was treated like a criminal. Today, he was treated like a leader. He wore a simple navy jacket and jeans, nothing flashy, but in his eyes there was a maturity far beyond his years. Beside him was his father, David, steady as ever, a man who had turned outrage into reform and personal pain into public progress. And behind them, reporters gathered quietly, waiting for the symbolic moment when Ethan would open the checking account he had tried to open months before. Yet the scene was not about banking paperwork. It was about reclaiming dignity, about showing the nation that injustice does not have the last word. Ethan placed his documents on the counter, the same kind of papers that had been mocked and dismissed. But this time, the teller, a newly trained youth specialist, accepted them with courtesy and care, walking him through each step, explaining every detail, no suspicion, no hostility, only respect. Within minutes, the account was opened, and when the clerk said, "Welcome to Heritage National, Mr. Carter. We're honored to have you," the applause that rose from the lobby was not just for a transaction completed, but for a cycle broken. David hugged his son tightly, and for a brief moment, father and son allowed themselves to breathe, knowing that what had begun as humiliation now stood as triumph. Yet outside those walls, the story had grown larger. Heritage National's reforms had become a model. Other banks across the country had adopted youth programs, anti-bias training, and oversight councils. The Federal Reserve even issued new guidelines recommending practices pioneered by the Carter Youth Justice Fund, turning one family's pain into national policy. Police departments, too, had been forced to change. Ethan's case studied in academies as a lesson in what not to do. Miller's resignation and Perez's demotion became warnings to officers that ignoring bias would end careers. And oversight boards sprang up in cities from Dallas to Chicago, demanding accountability. Parents across America began encouraging their children to open accounts, not with fear, but with confidence, knowing new protections were in place. Ethan himself had grown into an unlikely public figure, invited to youth conferences, interviewed by national media, his words printed in magazines, not because he sought attention, but because his honesty resonated. When asked what he wanted to do with his life, he smiled and said, "I don't know yet, maybe law, maybe business, but I know I want to make sure no kid ever feels like I did that day." And people believed him, because they saw in him not just a boy, but the echo of a movement. Meanwhile, the villains of his story faced the slow consequences of their choices. Karen Brooks, the once proud manager, now carried the stigma of criminal charges for false reporting. Her trial made headlines for a week, her defense flimsy, her convictions swift. She avoided prison, but was sentenced to community service and barred permanently from working in finance. Every time she applied for a job, her name carried the weight of disgrace. Melissa Green drifted into obscurity, her smirk forever preserved in viral clips used in training seminars as the face of contempt. Friends distanced themselves, employers hesitated, and she found herself explaining to strangers why her name brought uncomfortable silence. Officer Miller vanished from public service, his pension intact, but his reputation in ruins, while Officer Perez stayed in uniform but never regained trust, her every move scrutinized, her promotions gone, their stories reminders that prejudice carries a price, and that arrogance can burn down the lives of those who wield it. Yet for the Carter family, the legacy was not bitterness, but purpose. The Carter Youth Justice Fund expanded into a national foundation with chapters in 20 states, offering scholarships, legal aid, and financial literacy programs. Its hotline answered thousands of calls from families, many saying Ethan's story had given them courage to speak out. At a gala in Washington, D.C., attended by senators, judges, and business leaders, Ethan stood beside his father as they announced a $50 million partnership with universities to create internships for minority youth in banking and finance. The applause was thunderous, and David looked at his son with pride, whispering, "This is your work, Ethan. Your voice started this." Ethan shook his head, modest as ever. "No, Dad. This is for every kid who didn't have someone to fight for them." His humility touched even the most hardened executives in the room, proving that real power lies not in wealth or titles, but in character. Back in Houston, the community where it all began felt the change most deeply. Parents said officers treated their children with more respect. Young people walked into banks without fear. And at Westfield High, Ethan's classmates began organizing community projects in his name. What had begun as one boy's humiliation became a source of pride. The final image of this chapter came one quiet evening. Father and son sitting on the porch of their modest but beautiful home, the Texas sun sinking low, painting the sky in gold. Ethan asked softly, "Dad, do you think this will really last? Do you think people will keep fighting for what's right?" David put a hand on his shoulder. It will last as long as we keep reminding them, as long as voices like yours keep speaking. Ethan nodded, looking out at the horizon. The boy who once trembled at a bank counter now carried the weight of hope for a generation. His story told in boardrooms, classrooms, and training halls. A living reminder that dignity cannot be denied forever, that justice can rise even from humiliation, and that sometimes it takes the courage of a child and the strength of a parent to change not just one bank, not just one city, but an entire nation. Thank you so much for watching and supporting this story. If it touched you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us keep telling powerful stories that matter.